Welcome to Fish University, your one-stop shop for the science behind fish management. It is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network. I'm Wes Neal, your host. I'm an extension professor of fisheries and a researcher for Mississippi State University. Join me as I talk to researchers, managers, and landowners about the tools and science and the tricks of the trade for managing fish, water, and habitat. The goal is for you to have better fishing and a healthier aquatic ecosystem. So grab a notebook and the beverage of your choice and relax and enjoy Fish University. Welcome to Fish University. The scientific literature is filled with research on pond management and on managing large reservoirs. But somehow smaller lakes that fall in between these two size classes have been largely overlooked. The United States is filled with lakes that range from, say, 50 acres up to perhaps 400 to 500 acres. And these lakes don't necessarily behave like small ponds or like massive river impoundments. They're somewhere in between. So, what is a manager of a medium-sized lake to do? Well, graduate student Hayden Funk posed this same question for his master's research. He essentially asked the question, what drives fish dynamics in these in-between lakes? Hayden is here with me today and is ready to explain what he found and what management implications the research suggests. Good morning, Hayden. How are you doing today?
Morning, Wes. I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on here today.
Yeah, and I think full disclosure to the audience, you are a split graduate student. You have your major advisor is Dr. Steve Miranda, but I'm co-advisor, so it's not like you and I are meeting for the first time. This is my research as well. You've done some really cool stuff. You've done a lot of very different things. But before we get into all that, let's talk about your background, where you're coming from, how you got into fisheries management.
Yeah, so I grew up in Minnesota as an avid outdoorsman. I was going out and hunting and fishing any opportunity that I could. And my first real exposure to the field of fisheries came when I was in high school. I took an environmental science class, and one of the labs that we did was going out and doing some stream sampling, looking at stream macroinvertebrate communities. And that ended up leading to a summer internship doing that same thing with my local conservation district. And as an intern there, they sort of guided me towards going to the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, which I ended up doing, and I double majored in fisheries and aquatic sciences, as well as biology. Now, while I was attending UW-Stevens Point, I actually spent a summer down in Iowa working as a research technician for Iowa State University. That was my first real sort of fisheries field experience. I was going out every day sampling zooplankton and larval fish in the upper Mississippi River, and we were monitoring for invasive carp reproduction. So that's sort of where I cut my teeth in the field. And that zooplankton larval fish experience actually landed me a job with the Wisconsin Cooperative Fishery Research Unit my senior year at UW-Stevens Point. There I was just a lab technician. I was doing a lot of processing of larval fish samples as well as zooplankton samples. And upon graduation, they actually hired me on full-time as a fieldwork technician. And that has been my favorite job ever. I got to travel all over the state of Wisconsin working on various research projects. One week I'd be working on walleye recruitment bottlenecks in northern Wisconsin, and the next week I would be looking at sturgeon reproduction in central Wisconsin, and the week after that I'd be out in Lake Michigan doing smallmouth bass nesting surveys. And having all of those experiences eventually ended up what brought me down here to Mississippi State University to start looking at these small impoundments with you and Dr. Miranda back in January of 2022.
Yeah, and if any of the state agency folks are listening out there, Hayden is in the process of looking for jobs right now, so
That's
he is
correct.
available.
That is correct.
So you told us how you got here, and you came here with this project in mind that we don't know a whole lot about these smaller lakes. Homer Swingle back in the 1930s and 40s really worked out pond management for us. It's changed a little bit since then, but we've kind of known for years how bass bluegill dynamics in small ponds work. And people have been doing research in these great big flood control reservoirs. We've been studying the fish populations there for years. But as I said, these smaller lakes like state lakes, small 100-acre, 200, 300-acre lakes, we don't know nearly as much about them, and they are in some ways in between what a pond would act like and what a large reservoir would act like. So your research was really focused on these smaller systems, and I guess we should disclose smaller systems in the South, right? You focused exclusively in Mississippi. Mississippi is not going to be different than Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, North Carolina, but it's going to be quite a bit different from, say, Minnesota, Wisconsin. So we need to keep those sidebars on the conversation that we're talking about southern impoundments. With that being said, don't extrapolate what you're going to talk about today to these other lakes. But I think you found some really cool stuff that will apply all over. So let's get into that. Tell us, first of all, let's talk about the framework of your study. How did you lay the study out? What all did you look at? Sort of give us the guideposts of what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, absolutely. So our state department here, the Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks, or we'll probably refer to it as MDWFP here on out, they're currently managing 18 state lakes and 17 state park lakes. Now, there's no real functional difference between these two lakes, so pretty much the entirety of my research sort of just groups these lakes together as what we refer to as state lakes. As you mentioned, these lakes are kind of an in-between size, right? We have these big, massive flood control reservoirs that get a bunch of fishing pressure, a ton of management effort, and these sort of smaller in-between lakes tend to get forgot about. Mississippi began developing these state park lakes all the way back in the early 1930s using funds that were apportioned by the New Deal. The State Lakes program came on about 20 years later in the 1950s, and that was sort of an effort to create public fishing opportunities in areas that otherwise would not have many. And again, we refer to these sort of in-between size lakes. The smallest state lake is about 12 acres in size, and the largest is just under 900 acres in size. But generally, these lakes tend to be small. The median size of these lakes are about 100 acres, which again, the majority of them fall between 50 and 400 acres. And so because of their small size, these lakes really tend to lack habitat complexity. And because of that, they have simplified fish assemblages, really, that are dominated by centrarchids such as largemouth bass and bluegill. And I think it's important to note that throughout the years, new lakes have been acquired by the department, old lakes have been let go by the department. And so it's important to note that there's about 40 lakes that we're really talking about in this study here. So I just wanted to kind of touch on that to give an idea of my study area. But the overall framework for my research really closely followed the fisheries management model, which we really defined by three main pillars: the fish that we manage, the habitat that they live in, and the people that fish for them. And these three processes are highly interrelated, and they're oftentimes challenging because we as fisheries managers rarely have all the information that we need to manage these fish populations, habitats, and people with maximum effectiveness. So that's really sort of the knowledge gap that my project was trying to bridge, right? The overall goal for this project was to help advance current management programs, suggest a framework for efficiently managing fisheries and state lakes in the future.
So we're really talking about what we call the Venn diagram of fish management, those three overlapping circles that we often saw in our fisheries management classes, where you have fish, the habitat, and the people. And the people are usually what's overlooked. And I'm so glad that your project addressed that towards the end. We'll talk about the people side of things, because we all go to school to become fish biologists, oftentimes because we're introverts, because we love to be outside, we don't like to be around people, and we want to work with fish. But most of the biologists find when they get out of grad school and they go off to work for a state agency is that they spend as much time working with people as they do with animals or habitats. So we can't forget about the people. I kind of think about the way this project was. I always refer to it as one of Dr. Miranda's black box studies, where he takes every piece of data that is available in the system, puts it into the black box, and magic happens. Essentially, what we're talking about here are multivariate statistical approaches where we take all the available data and we look for trends, we look for relationships, and we then try to figure out what makes those relationships tick, right?
Yeah, that's correct. So I'll sort of start this out by talking about, I guess, sort of the habitat side of this black box analysis. So we split our habitat variables into two main categories. We have in-lake variables and off-lake variables. And so our in-lake variables included common things such as lake depth, alkalinity, hardness, conductivity, dissolved solids. We took benthic sediment samples to sort of get a look at in-lake nutrients. We took temperature and dissolved oxygen profiles to be able to include variables such as depth to thermocline, things like that. Our second main category of habitat variables that we wanted to collect were these sort of off-lake variables, so things such as lake surface area, shoreline length, shoreline development index, as well as watershed land cover variables, percent agriculture, percent forested, percent developed, percent wetlands, as well as we wanted an understanding of what was within a 30-meter riparian buffer zone of each of these lakes. So we went out and collected all of these habitat variables sort of to start to kind of get a baseline, right? Because before you have a place for fish, you need a place for them to live. So then the second sort of side to this analysis was the fish community side of things. And to analyze the fish communities that are present in each of these lakes, we actually leveraged MDWFP's electrofishing survey database, which is really sort of this cool, unique database that we have that includes shocking data for all of these lakes dating all the way back to 1986. So we have this really awesome, complete long-term data set. And for this fish community analysis, we really focused in exclusively on largemouth bass and bluegills. We did this for sort of two reasons. The first one being that 81% of the fish that we have sampled from these lakes using electrofishing since 1986 were either bass or bluegill. Now, that's not necessarily representative of the fish communities that are present in these lakes. That's more, I guess, a representation of our gear cell activity, where we're sampling, how we're sampling. But at the end of the day, that's what we had. The second reason we really wanted to focus in on largemouth bass and bluegills is that because in these small to medium-sized southern impoundments, the fish communities that are within are so often shaped by largemouth bass and bluegill predator-prey dynamics. So essentially, using this database that we had, we calculated various length-based variables for the bass and bluegill communities that were present in each lake, such as the PSD, the mean length, the maximum length. And essentially, having all of these variables allowed us to sort of classify these lakes along a predator-prey spectrum or a predator-prey continuum. Right, on one end of this spectrum, we have lakes that have a large overall bass size structure, but a very low bluegill size structure, or what we referred to throughout the study as a quality bass fishery, where we may have fewer bass overall, but the bass on average are going to be of that larger size that's more desirable to anglers. And on the flip side of that, we have a ton of small bluegill that are present within that system as a forage base, which results in having a smaller overall bluegill size structure. And sort of on the opposite end of that predator-prey spectrum, we have lakes that have a bass crowded community, and that's going to be characterized by having sort of this high abundance of bass that are in the 10 to 14 inch range that are all competing for resources, which ends up resulting sort of in this population bottleneck where not a lot of fish are going to get larger than that 14 inch size range. And these systems generally are regarded as undesirable because anglers in general want to catch big bass. However, these situations do sort of present a unique management opportunity to provide a high-action bass fishery and or provide a trophy or quality bluegill fishery, because the bluegill that are essentially able to escape the gape limitation of these numerous small bass are able to grow to large sizes. And sort of in the middle of that spectrum exists this dynamic balance, I guess I'll call it, which is really difficult to achieve and perhaps even more difficult to maintain as a fish community. But the bottom line of this predator-prey spectrum is that knowing where each of these 40 lakes throughout time falls along this bass bluegill predator-prey spectrum is going to be very important for lake managers. So essentially what we did is we computed all of these length-based variables for both bass and bluegill, and we put them into this black box. And this black box that we're referring to is a program called Primer 7. Which is sort of this multivariate analysis software, really awesome, really user-friendly. So essentially we start with a spreadsheet that has all 40 of our lakes as rows and all 8 of our length variables that we calculated as columns. And once this is in Primer, we can transform the data using any transformation that we want to sort of reduce skew. Then we compute a similarity coefficient between each possible lake combination to produce what's called an ordination. And an ordination is sort of this collective catch-all term for a set of multivariate statistical analyses where we're aiming to represent samples from a multidimensional data set into low-dimensional space. And that allows us to sort of tease out any patterns that the data may possess and make them become evident to us visually. Throughout my research, we relied on a non-metric multidimensional scaling approach, which is sort of this technique that plots the distances apart of all sample points such that the rank order of dissimilarities among pairs of samples are preserved in the ranks of the corresponding distances on that ordination plot. So that's a lot of jargon. The too long didn't read version of that is when Primer spits out this plot, it allows for a very straightforward interpretation. The sample points that are ordinated closer together are more similar in terms of the variables that we use to ordinate them. So essentially, lakes that appear on this plot as closer together have similar fish communities present. And visually speaking, when Primer spit out these ordinations, the ordinations that it produced followed this really sort of predictable visual spectrum of that predator-prey relationship that I just described almost to a T. So now that we have this really awesome and really elegant visual interpretation of what's going on in these 40 lakes, where all 40 lakes are on the same plot, we can overlay these habitat variables on top of that ordination now as vectors to describe the extent of the correlation between each of those habitat variables and axis 1 and 2 of our ordination. And this allows us to see which of those habitat variables are linked to which fish community types, right? And so essentially what this analysis found is that in-lake productivity is really what's governing these fish communities. Lakes that have shallower thermoclines, lakes that had higher alkalinity, higher hardness, lakes that had more phosphorus present in their benthic sediment, lakes that had higher level of dissolved solids, right? All of these variables that suggest that a lake is more productive were those that had quality bass fisheries present. And sort of on the flip side of that predator-prey spectrum, lakes that had higher flushing rates, lakes that were deeper, clearer, lakes that had deeper thermoclines, resided within heavily forested watersheds, right? All things that suggest to us as fishery managers that a lake is less productive were those that tended to contain bass-crowded communities.
You describe these lakes really more along a small impoundment model than a large lake model. It sounds like you're more following swingle pond dynamics than what we know about a larger reservoir system. The spectrum of predator and prey, big bass, small bluegill, a lot of small bass, big bluegill, and the productivity driving the system as such that you create greater biomass with more nutrients. So it sounds like we're following more of a small impoundment dynamic than the typical large reservoir system, which is more riverine influenced. Would you agree?
Yeah, that's correct. Like I said, these lakes are really small in terms of their size, and because of that, they don't have a ton of available habitat present. And because of that sort of lack of habitat, the species richness tends to be really low, and we tend to see these simplified fish communities present, which makes it a little bit easier on us in terms of a management standpoint because, a lot of these smaller systems and medium systems are really controlled by that largemouth bass predation.
The thing that surprises me is the fact that you've got two things going on. You've got productivity, and then you've got sport fish management. Just because a lake's highly productive doesn't mean it's going to have quality bass because, it could have a very large population of small stunted bass. Whereas a deep, clear lake, just because it's not productive doesn't mean it doesn't have a few really big bass in it. So your PSD, which is the percentage of large fish compared to all the fish essentially, might be really high in a lake that's deep and clear, but there's just not very many of them. So it's kind of surprising that it did follow that, even though you don't have the same fishing pressure on all these lakes, and we still struggle with the same lack of harvest of bass that we have in other systems where people just no longer want to keep bass. It's all catch and release mentality nowadays. So it's kind of surprising it follows those patterns, even though the pressure may be different on these systems and not related to the productivity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that another thing that we really tried to do with this analysis is sort of weed out the outliers. We used a couple of different length-based variables, right? We used PSD, mean length. We used a variable called top 30 where we took the largest 30 fish that we've caught. We also used maximum length. And sort of what that allowed us to do, and I think something that's important to keep in mind about this analysis is that this is 40 lakes across almost 40 years of data. So there's certainly always going to be those outliers. But what was really cool to see is that these 40 lakes across the last 40 years really do sort of follow that nice, predictable predator-prey community spectrum. So I think that was definitely one of the coolest findings of this chapter in my research.
Yeah, and it's important to point out, too, that these 40 lakes over the 40-year period, they may have changed significantly within themselves. So one lake may have been a bass-crowded lake that then became a trophy bass lake, or might have been drained and rebuilt during that time frame. A lot of things are going on in that period. So it's not a static situation by any stretch of the imagination, right?
Yep, that's correct. Yep.
And one thing to point out, too, is you focused on bass and bluegill, but you had a predecessor that did some state lake work that looked at crappie populations. And what he found was kind of similar. He found, first of all, that depth and productivity, it influenced crappie species. So in lakes that were shallow and productive, he tended to find white crappie dominated. And in lakes that were deep and clear, black crappie tended to dominate. But he also found that the crappie, just like the bluegill, their populations appeared to be driven by largemouth bass dynamics, where, again, if you have a lake with very few bass, crappie tend to overpopulate, become small, skinny, those little potato chip crappie that nobody wants to catch. Whereas if you have a bass crowded situation, you tended to produce better crappie. Those lakes basically followed the same idea that you're talking about with the bass and bluegill. It also affected the crappie in the same ways. So I mentioned that, these lakes change over that 40-year period, and a lot of them are what we call renovated. Mississippi kind of follows this pattern of where they like to drain a lake periodically. Like to might not be the right term. It's probably they need to because the dam starts leaking or something happens. One reason or another, they need to start a lake over again. So a lot of these state lakes have gone through periods of renovation at about 15 to 20-year intervals, where they will drain the lake completely. They'll retool the dam. They'll retool the habitat. They might adjust the shoreline, and then they refill it up. So let's talk about that and how you found the lakes respond to this renovation.
Right. And so renovation is really this awesome management action that I think is sort of, unique to this size lake group, right? It's where we go in, we completely drain the lake, and we refill it. We add habitat as needed. We restock it. We let the fish community sort of regulate itself for 2 to 3 years, and then we open it up to fishing. And now, renovation is a pretty extreme management action, right? But in these small impoundments, it can actually be more cost effective and more time efficient in order to sort of enhance these severely degraded fish habitats and fish communities. And to put this in the context of my research within state lakes, MDWFP has renovated 26 times over the years at 22 different lakes. And sort of what we see when we renovate one of these lakes is this new impoundment effect, where nutrient levels within the lake explode post-renovation. And as a result, the primary production within the lake increases and causes this sort of trophic upsurge. And so that uptick in primary production is going to create really good fishing opportunities for our anglers for a couple reasons. Number one, the fish in the system are able to grow really rapidly. And number two, the fish are typically naive since they haven't seen an angler's lure in the past 2 to 3 years. So for a few weeks after these lakes get reopened after renovation, the department sees this really high catch rate among anglers. But a few weeks after that, we see this really steep drop off after this initial period of high catch rates. And so that's something that my project sort of wanted to ask the question of, what can we do to prolong this renovation boom? And historically, this sort of steep decline could really be blamed on our high harvest rates. But since the early 2000s, we've really seen an uptick in the catch and release ethic. So overharvest isn't necessarily the issue in most of these systems. And what we found in our review is that this rapid decline in catch rates is really likely the product of fish becoming smart, for lack of a better term. There's this well-documented inverse relationship between the density or number of vulnerable fish in our lake after renovation and the amount of fishing effort that's being put forth to capture them. And there's been a lot of really good research in the last 2 decades that has actually shown fish do respond to catch and release by potentially becoming temporarily unreactive to fishing gear, or even by learning to avoid fishing gear entirely. Furthermore, there's research that suggests that there are physiological consequences to the fish upon being caught, which can lead to a lower metabolic rate and could also lead to decreased angling vulnerability over time. And I think finally, and perhaps most interesting, is that there's been some research that's come out recently suggesting that angling vulnerability can actually be heritable for bass. In other words, the offspring of these heavily fished bass populations can actually become less vulnerable to fishing gear. And with all of these considerations in mind, it really seemed like the solution to us was to prolong that high initial period of angler catch rates post-renovation, was limiting the amount of angling pressure that these fish are receiving. And this sort of becomes this tricky tightrope walk between managers and anglers, because anglers really generally hold this right to fish sentiment, where I have a right to fish. And so what we sort of had to do is suggest ways to the department that they could allow anglers to still capitalize on fishing these lakes after renovation without necessarily pressuring that fishery too much.
Wow, there's so many things to unpack in that one. First, let's talk about the new lake effect, because let's explain what's going on there. When you drain a lake, you allow terrestrial vegetation to grow up, and you get grasses all throughout the lake, trees, whatever it may be. All that organic matter that's now in the lake, when you flood it, it's going to slowly decompose over time, adding nutrients, adding food for shredders and other animals that are out there. But over time, that material, the leaf litter, the grasses, and so forth, it decomposes. And when it's gone, it's gone. It doesn't come back. You might get in-lake production of weeds eventually, plants of some sort, but it's not at the same level of all the terrestrial vegetation that was there when you first impounded the lake. And usually, I guess, lakes go through what we call a boom and bust cycle, where You impound a lake, and I guess fishing's typically best at about 5 to 7 years post impoundment was when the fishing peaks, because that's when the bass are reaching their larger sizes and you still got lots of productivity, and then nutrient levels start to drop. And after 15 or so years, pretty much all the productivity is reliant on nutrients that are coming in from outside the system. Nutrients that are still in the soil that are upsurging and nutrients that are washing in drives the in-lake productivity, or what we call the autochthonous production. Big word, but all it means is in-lake productivity. Or you're getting leaf litter and other things coming in from outside, which we call our allochthonous or outside production. But you're being driven by in-lake productivity early and then kind of reliant on outside of the lake productivity later, so the productivity overall goes down. So that's what we're seeing from these lakes, is that fishing is great right at first, and then the lakes 15, 20 years down the road aren't nearly as good. But what you're saying is that fishing is really good within the first couple of years, and it declines. Even though the fish may still be there, people aren't catching them anymore. It's like I've heard stories of Lake Monroe and a few other of these state lakes that they'll open them up, and bass anglers will have 50 and 100 fish a day catch rates. But then just weeks later, those are down to single digits because the bass have all been caught. They've all got sore mouths and they're hook shy. So, that's really interesting that happens. And you said you've suggested some ways to get around it. What are some of the things you've suggested?
All right. And something that I think is really important to build off on that new impoundment effect that you described is that I think when I think a new impoundment, I think a lot of these larger impoundments, these large reservoirs. And you're absolutely right. The best fishing tends to come a few years after that, especially in terms of our bass size structure, right? Because the bass have had time to grow up and feed. But something that I think is important to note about how these smaller systems are different is that, when a large impoundment opens, there's a ton of areas for the fish to be, I guess, to sort of hide out from anglers. But these small or 50 to 100 acre lake systems, it's a lot tougher to be a fish, especially once we see this really high initial angling effort. So as you mentioned, in these smaller systems, that sort of angling boom can actually drop off within the first few weeks. And so, as I mentioned, one of the things that we wanted to look at is how do we sort of regulate anglers without taking away people's right to fish these lakes, because everybody wants to go fish these lakes and catch a bunch of fish after they open. So what we did is suggest a few ways that we could still allow anglers to fish these lakes after renovation, but without sort of adding too much of that angling pressure. And so in some of the larger lakes, our 300 to 400 acre lakes, like Elvis Presley, for instance, we suggested maybe establishing sort of this refuge area where fishing is not allowed. And we'd sort of have this slow, steady stream of naive fish that can move in and out of this refuge area. I use Elvis Presley as an example because it has a nice upper arm that would be pretty easy to block off and sort of sign off as a no fishing area. And there's some evidence of this working back in the 1970s when new lakes opened and overharvest was really an issue. And so I think it would be kind of interesting sort of to set up an experiment or a case study on one of these larger lakes where we take, maybe a 100-acre arm out of the 400 to 500 acre lake total and establish it as this sort of refuge area for fish to get away from that angling pressure.
How do you select the arm? I mean, you've already talked about the angler comes at it with a right to fish attitude. What if a group of anglers, that's their arm, that's their fishing spot, and you just say, hey, we're going to close this and you can never go in it again? How do you deal with that?
Well, and I think the important thing to note is that it wouldn't necessarily be we would close it and never open it to an angler again. It would just really be to sort of flatten out that really steep drop off of catch rates. So, the first few weeks is when these lakes get the majority of their fishing pressure because, it's a big news release that Lake Elvis Presley is opening back up again, and nobody's been able to fish it for 2 to 3 years, so everybody wants to go back to their favorite local fishing spot and fish it. So I think it would be really important to sort of reach out to the public and say, hey, we're going to establish this refuge zone sort of to give fish this refuge area, so to prolong this catch rate. I think it would just be a matter of transparency with the public. We're not closing this area so you can't fish your favorite spot. We're closing this area so the fishing boom prolongs a little bit further on down the road in time than it would without that area being closed off.
What if you rotated locations in the lake to where you close this area when you first open it up, because you may get another boom in fishing pressure when people say, hey, they're opening up the arm, and the boats are lined up at the gate. And that's one thing to point out is a lot of these lakes, when they do open them up, it's usually announced that the lake will be opening on this date. It is not uncommon to have boats lined up at the gate ready to go the moment they open it up. I mean, people really know the fishing is going to be good.
Right, and not just hundreds of boats lined up at the lake, but hundreds of people lined up on the shore. One thing that these small state-owned lakes really provide is quality shore fishing opportunities. So these fish are sort of going to be subject to this two-prong attack where you've got hundreds of boats coming lined up on the lake and hundreds of people lined up on the bank all trying to catch these fish, in this 100 to 150 acre lake. So I think that's, again, why we really see that steeper drop-off in angler catch rates than we would with, say, a larger impoundment that's been newly opened.
So I was suggesting, what if you rotate protected areas where you say, okay, well, this lake has 3 major coves. This cove will be closed for 4 months, and this cove will be closed for 4 months. And it just goes through that process year after year, always providing some new habitat with relatively naive fish that haven't been targeted for at least 4 months. Problem is how do you police that? How do you enforce that? I mean, you're going to have to move buoys out there and say no access and move those buoys every 4 months. And what if an angler's not paying attention and you catch them in there? Are you really going to give them a ticket when, it's pretty hard to rope off a cove?
Our regulations and fisheries are only as effective as, the people that follow them, right? And so that's definitely something that the department would have to take into consideration to sort of undertake one of these case studies. Yeah. Another thing that we suggested to sort of avoid all of that, management and policing concern was potentially, instead of rotating the closed area, why don't we rotate the days that these lakes are open? Right now, the lake opens up and it's just open to fish for the public. And what we do here with our WMAs, or our wildlife management areas, is, we only have them open on certain days. So say Wednesdays, Saturdays, and Sundays, right? We could limit the amount of days that the lake is open to fishing. So we wouldn't necessarily have to limit the amount of people. So, everybody would still have their right to fish. They just wouldn't necessarily have their right to fish on Tuesday. But, say Wednesday, Saturday, Sunday, I think is typically how WMAs are run down here. It'd be open to anybody. And so what that would do is kind of give the fish intermittent breaks instead of just having this constant 2-week period of just being fished for and fished for and fished for.
But I work weekends and I'm only off on Tuesdays, Hayden. What happens to me?
I guess you're going to have to be like the rest of us and call in sick to work. When your boss is out there fishing Lake Mary Crawford after it opens and sees you out there after you called in sick, then I guess you're going to have some explaining.
Hey, I just told the agencies to hire you, and now you're telling me you're going to call in sick. Hello, everyone. Thanks for listening to Fish University. Do you have a question or a topic for the podcast? If so, you can email me at Wes, that's WES, .Neal, that's NEAL, at Mississippi State. That's MSSTATE.edu. Or instead, please visit the Fish University Facebook page. On the Facebook page, you will find useful articles, videos, stories, and other information, as well as updates on upcoming podcasts. Not to mention, you can send me a private message with questions or suggestions. Just search Fish University and look for our colorful logo. And please follow the Fish University page. We need your support. Now back to the show. You mentioned this idea that bass get smart. And you also talked about the heritability of that trait. A listener may think, well, how in the world does a bass pass on don't catch me genetics, we'll call them, if people aren't harvesting fish? So in the old days when bass harvest was high and people would go out and they'd catch, a dozen fish and they took home 8 fish, then they're removing the fish that are more likely to bite and leaving the fish that are less likely to bite. It's easier to see how that's genetically changing the population. But nowadays, with catch and release being so high, it's not necessarily as easy to see how we're affecting the population on a genetic level. But keep in mind that not every fish that is released survives. You still have some catch and release mortality going on. And if the fish that bite often, a fish is really hook friendly, that fish is going to be caught over and over and over again. And the risk of mortality being caught is compounding for that fish. So maybe only a fish dies every 10% of the time it's caught. Well, if a fish is caught 50 times, chances are it's going to die eventually. But more than that, it's probably what we're seeing happen in these lakes is that the fish are simply learning. And it's not something that lasts the lifetime of the fish. We did a study a few years back on some small ponds where fishing was allowed on some of the ponds, and then we shut the fishing down for a period of time, and then we came back and we found that catch rates went back up. They never reached that unfished level again, but they definitely went back up and then fell off again as fishing pressure ensued. So bass can unlearn as well as learn, but it does take some period of time. So this idea of shutting down coves for a period of time, even if they've been fished previously, will cause the fish to forget about the behavior or forget about fishing and potentially bite better. There's even been studies that have shown that, a bass learns lure specific learning, to where you go out with a green worm and you catch a bass. Well, it's not going to bite a green worm again, but it might bite a red worm. And then you catch it on a red worm. Well, both things look like a worm, so now I'm not going to bite anything that looks like a worm. So if you go out there this time with an Alabama rig, well, that looks totally different. I might bite that. So there's a lot of things going on we don't fully understand, but we do know for sure that when fishing starts up, the fish bite better than when fishing has been going on for some time. First, because they're learning, and second, because the productivity of the system declines over time. And eventually, 15, 20 years out, the lake is, I won't say it's not useful at all, but it's nowhere near as good of a fishery as it was when it first opened up. That suggests that this renovation as a management tool is a good thing. And now it's not cheap. It's certainly not cheap to drain a lake, retool the bottom with heavy machinery, reintroduce habitat, refill the lake, restock the lake, let it mature for a year or two before reopening it. All of that, from the actual direct expenditures to the lost income of not opening the lake, that's an expense for the management agency, but it is something that is effective at creating a buzz about the lake, getting anglers out there, and the fishing tends to be a whole lot better. So what is your recommendation to the management agencies?
Yeah, I think it really varies sort of on a lake-to-lake basis. As you mentioned, it is very expensive and it is a high cost expenditure, but this sort of renovation action can actually be more cost effective and more time efficient compared to sort of these corrective management applications that are, for lack of a better term, a Band-Aid on a bullet hole. And another really good thing about renovations is that you are wiping the slate clean and you are starting fresh. So this really is a guarantee. If you find out that your habitat is degraded in your lake, or the fish community is completely out of whack, and you spend a lot of time and money on sort of a corrective management action, say we implement some habitats, or we do something to the fish community to change that static fish community, there's not necessarily that guarantee that management action is going to lead to a direct result, right? And so that's something that's really nice about these renovations, is that they are this guarantee. So in terms of what I would recommend, it's really going to depend on a lake-by-lake basis. A smaller lake that's super unproductive and the fish community is completely static, nobody's fishing there anymore, that's not going to make money for us as an agency, right? These lakes, we sell fishing passes for them to try and make a little bit of money as an agency. And I think that, if you have that lake that's completely degraded and it hasn't been renovated in 15, 20 years, that's certainly when I would renovate, because as you mentioned, not only is that going to help the fish community, help the habitat within the lake, but it's going to sort of create this buzz around the lake that might help us sell our lake to some of these anglers and get them to come fish our lake and buy passes and buy fishing licenses again.
Yeah, when you renovate a lake, you can fix all those problems so much easier. The lake is unproductive because the water chemistry is bad. You can drive a spreader truck around the dry basin a whole lot easier than applying lime to a full lake. If you need to if you're going to fertilize the lake, which some agencies do, you can install fertilization platforms and prepare for that. If you need new structures, a new boat ramp, new fishing piers, anything like that, they're a whole lot easier to build on dry land. The other thing that you need to consider, or when you renovate a lake like that, is when you restock, you're setting up the fish communities for success. You're putting the right numbers of predators and prey together at the right sizes that we've studied it. We know how it works. You won't have any issues. What we found, and we've talked about this a whole lot in this podcast, is it's much easier to start from scratch than it is to try to restore fish populations to some fishable level. it's theoretically possible to take little bass out when you have a bass crowded lake and restore the bass. The reality is it rarely works, and it rarely works because you're dealing with, one, it's very hard to remove that many fish, whether it's anglers doing it or whether it's managers doing it. You need to take out large numbers of small bass, and then you get recruitment on top of that. The bass that remain are going to try to fill the void, and they're just going to make more little bass that take the place of the fish you took out. Add to that, once a bass population is crowded, a 12-inch bass could be a 4 or 5 or 6-year-old bass. It's already lost a large portion of its growth potential. And if they're thin, let's say they've got a relative weight, and the relative weight is just the percentage of what that fish weighs compared to a fish of healthy size for that length. If a fish is only 80% or 70% or even worse of what it could weigh, then it has to get enough food to recover its weight before it ever really starts to grow. It's just really hard to get a bass population to recover after it's been in that state for any amount of time. So sure, you could spend a ton of money electrofishing the heck out of the lake to remove bass, and maybe using rotenone on the shoreline to kill off recruitment, and trying to increase productivity through fertilization and liming and stocking new prey species and all these different things. And in the end, it's unsuccessful. Whereas drain the lake, start over again, it's going to be successful. It's going to be good fishing for at least a number of years before populations catch up. And if you are on top of the management at that point in time, you can keep the fishing good through both encouraging anglers to take fish out as well as using management removals early on, trying to keep the predator and prey in a situation where everybody's got enough food and everybody's growing happy. And you can do water quality management on the new lake and keep things happy. So you're right. When you renovate a lake, it's cheaper than if you try to restore an old lake to glory without trying to drain it and start over again. It takes longer, or it might take longer. I would say it takes less time if you're never successful restoring an old lake without draining it. And Hayden, you didn't stop with managing the lake and its habitat, right? You also looked at angler use. And I thought it was real interesting. You use this economic supply and demand approach to look at the effort on these lakes to help MDWFP better understand where they need to focus their attention, correct?
Right, absolutely. And like you said, it's generally understood that not all water bodies are going to receive the same amount of angler use. And because of this, conservation agencies such as MDWFP are often going to be required to make management allocation decisions. So quantifying this resource use has always sort of been of interest to us fisheries managers to guide where we focus our management. Now, it's not necessarily a straightforward process, though, to guess where these anglers are going to be diverting their angling attention, because there's countless factors that influence where an angler decides to fish that day, right? Things like water clarity, facility quality, the quality of the shore fishing opportunities present, bag limits, past experiences, landscape aesthetics, right? The list goes on and on and on. And all of these things are really hard to collect, really hard to quantify, and even harder to sort of incorporate into a model to predict resource use. And I think that sort of the elegance of the approach that we used was the simplicity of it. So essentially what we did is we took all 35 lakes that are currently managed by MDWFP, and we drew a 40-mile circle around them. This is what we discovered to be approximately our average angler trip distance. So within that 40-mile radius, we extracted the amount of acres of public fishing water that were present in that radius, so the distance or the proximity to other public fishing opportunities. And that's what we treated as our supply within this supply and demand model that we created. We then took that same 40-mile radius and we used U.S. Census data to extract the human population density in that radius, which we treated as our demand for this fish resource. And from there, we were able to calculate an expected fishing pressure index by dividing our human population density by the acres of public fishing water within the radius to get a people per acre value for each lake.
Yeah, so what you found, if I recall, was that there are certain parts of the state where the supply and demand model showed we need more water, and there's certain areas where we have lots of lakes and in relatively low populations of people, fishing access is no longer a big issue because they have lots of opportunities. Tell us more about that.
Right. So what we found is that here in Mississippi, our human population is fairly evenly distributed. Now, Mississippi in general is a pretty rural state. We do have a few population centers, but in general, what we found is that these 40-mile radiuses had pretty equal human population densities all across the state. However, the amount of public fishing opportunities within these 40-mile radiuses was not evenly distributed throughout the state. And what we found is that there were about 10 to 12 lakes in the southern, southeastern part of our state that this model identified as having a significantly higher number of people per acre of public fishing water. So, we used this people per acre index to group all 35 of these lakes into three groups, right? We had a high expected fishing pressure group, a moderate expected fishing pressure group, and a low expected fishing pressure group. And we sort of wanted to use that as a guide of where and how to allocate these management resources. But, these lakes, these groups that we grouped these lakes into, they were sort of arbitrary groups. So what we wanted to do is sort of confirm or validate these groups. And luckily for us, whether you want to launch your boat at one of these lakes or fish from shore at one of these state lakes, you have to buy a fishing pass. So we were able to take the pass sale data that we had for all of these lakes over the past 20 years, and we ended up using an analysis called a permutational analysis of covariance. And I won't get into it, but essentially what that allowed us to do is compare our three expected pressure groups in terms of the number of pass sales that these lakes were actually seeing and recording. And what we found is that, yes, these lakes that we identified as having a high expected angling pressure were selling significantly more passes on average than our lakes that our model identified as having a low expected angling pressure. And so, armed with this information, we sort of wanted to take it a step further and see what was driving those angler pass sales. So to sort of get at this, we used what's called a distance-based linear model. And again, it's very similar to a normal linear regression model. It's just slightly more flexible in terms of the types of data that you can incorporate. And what we used as our response variable was our pass sales, right? The pass sales over the past 20 years. And we used three simple factors. We used our population density, the amount of public fishing water available in proximity to these lakes, as well as our overall lake size of the lake that we were studying as our explanatory variables. And what we found is that lake size was significantly and positively correlated with pass sales, whereas the amount of water or our proximity to other fishing opportunities within the radius was significantly and negatively correlated to pass sales. So essentially, larger lakes, as well as lakes that had less available fishing opportunities surrounding them, were the lakes that were selling more passes or receiving more angling pressure. And interestingly, this analysis found that this was all independent of the human population density surrounding the lake. That explanatory variable was actually found to be insignificant in predicting pass sales. So I think the cool part about this part of my research is that we were able to take a very complex topic in modeling angler use patterns or fishing pressure in these systems and accurately predict it with just a few easy-to-collect variables to sort of guide our management in these systems in the future.
So you're saying that the larger the lake, the more passes that were sold. Did you look at people per acre on those systems? I mean, were they similar in terms of density, or did the larger lakes have a higher density than the smaller lakes? If you have a 50-acre lake and you sell 50 passes, and you have a 200-acre lake and you sell 200 passes, the density of anglers using the lake, anglers per acre, is the same, right?
Right, and yeah, so that's why we corrected for that. So when we were comparing our three pressure groups, we corrected for that by using people per acre of public water in that area. But when we were looking at the factors that were sort of driving these pass sales, and we were using that distance-based linear model, we had to use just raw pass sales as our response variable to sort of avoid multicollinearity because we wanted to investigate the effect of lake size on those pass sales.
So Hayden, that sounds like you did a whole lot for your thesis research. Let's wrap up by talking about what your take-home messages are for the audience in terms of what factors really influence the management of these lakes. And if you have any management recommendations that we could pass on to state managers or other people that are managing medium-sized bodies of water, what would you recommend?
Yeah, absolutely. So I can think of three big ones that really popped up a lot throughout the different chapters of my research. The first one being habitat aging. Similar to our larger artificial reservoirs across the United States, habitats within these smaller Mississippi small impoundments or state lakes, as we've been referring to them as, they're aging and degrading. So proper habitat management is really key in these systems. A lot of these older lakes, the ones that haven't been renovated in 15 to 20 years, we're seeing an overall degradation of the lake environment, which can lead to issues such as algal blooms, poor water quality, and a lack of habitat heterogeneity. All of these are bad for fishing, right? And so proper management practices such as monitoring our water quality parameters, controlling invasive species spread is going to be a big one in the coming years, preserving our native vegetation, and maintaining and replenishing fish attracting structures is really going to help us sustain a healthy ecosystem in these smaller impoundments. The second big theme that sort of kept popping up within my research, as we talked about, is productivity. And my research found that about half of these lakes have a very low level of in-lake productivity, which is why liming and fertilizing so often takes place in these systems. Now, it's important to note that when we start a fertilization regime, it's really important that once we implement it, we maintain it, because we need to prevent that fish population from exceeding that lake's newly increased carrying capacity. And, this increased carrying capacity is also going to warrant increased attention to fish harvest and making sure that proper levels of fish harvest are occurring. So I guess the take-home message there is that, we need to be monitoring, again, these water quality parameters to make sure that our lake has a good in-lake productivity value, as well as, sort of to couple with that, sufficient fish harvest to occur.
Yeah, and with the fertilization, you hit the nail right on the head when you said it's important to, when you start, that it's maintained indefinitely, as well as done correctly. I think I see in the pond world, more often than not, fertilization is either done improperly. People think they just do it once a year and they're done, whereas it really takes, typical lake may have 10 to 15 applications per year from March till October. And once you start it and you raise carrying capacity, you bring carrying capacity, you can actually increase it 200, 300, possibly as much as 400%. I mean, that would be an extreme case. But if you've got 3 times the biomass of fish in your lake and you suddenly stop fertilizing, well, it's essentially you're cutting the food availability of the lake to a third of what it was. And now you've got a bunch of hungry fish out there that are going to starve. And fish don't usually starve to death. They just starve and get skinny and thin, and slowly over time, the population goes to crap pretty quick. So when you decide to fertilize, it's a big decision because it's kind of a long-term commitment and not cheap. The state agencies probably use the cheaper bulk fertilizer because that's the way to go for large lakes and keeps the price down, but that's going to be an expense. It's going to be a labor expense. You got to have somebody there to check the water. Once you check the water, you got to put the fertilizer out, and that's an investment. So a lot of the state lakes, they don't fertilize because it is such a time and financial investment.
Yeah, and so then I guess the third take-home message after, proper habitat management and proper productivity management, again, is proper people management. And again, what we found in this study is that we have these lakes that are experiencing really high angler use pressure. And so in those lakes, the take-home message is we need to make sure that we're maintaining quality facilities. We need to make sure we have an increased level of bank accessibility so people can kind of space out. And we need to ensure good fishing via proper habitat management. Because we really need to make sure that even in these sort of, overpressured or overcrowded systems, that every angler is still leaving these lakes satisfied. Because if they go there and the lake is overused, the shore fishing area is sort of degraded and, there's trash everywhere, we might lose them not only as a state lake angler, but as an angler in general. And sort of on the flip side of that, we identified lakes throughout the state that are experiencing lower pressure than what they can maintain. And these tend to be areas that are in close proximity to other fishing opportunities. So for that reason, in these sort of low pressure lakes, we need to give anglers a reason to come fish our lakes, right? We can do this by advertising notable catches from our state lakes on social media. We can promote fishing on species that are potentially underutilized or underfished for, such as catfish. And we can create or maintain fishing opportunities that are different than what's in the area. This is a hypothetical example, but if we have a state lake that is 10 miles away from Grenada Lake and we're trying to manage it for a crappie fishery, that's probably not a great idea since a world-famous crappie fishery is 10 minutes away. So what we really want to focus on in those areas is creating or maintaining sort of these diverse fishing opportunities that are different than everything else. Again, all in an effort to sort of give people a reason to come fish state lakes specifically and continue to capitalize on them as anglers.
Well, Hayden, It sounds like your thesis was very in-depth with a lot of different avenues that you explored. And again, to the state agency folks, Hayden is available and looking for a job right now. So please don't wait. He'll be snatched up pretty quickly. But Hayden, thanks for coming on today. I hope the audience was able to follow some of your stats and at least understand the general take-home messages of what the best management techniques for these medium-sized lakes are. And good luck in the future.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
And thanks, everybody, for listening to Fish University. Catch us next time.
Fish University is hosted by Wes Neal, an employee of Mississippi State University Extension Service and a faculty member in the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Aquaculture. This podcast is part of the Natural Resources University network of podcasts. Funding was provided by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you have questions or suggestions, please go to the Extension website at extension.mississippistate.edu. Click on Natural Resources and then select the Fisheries tab in the drop-down menu. Or you can email me at wes.neal@msstate.edu.